Okay, so I wanted to be sure and go over for those of you who are going to be gone for theater or for basketball or whatever's going on Thursday and Friday, some of these concepts that are in these documents. I think this will make it a little bit, make it kind of help you when you get to the Eastfield essay next week, and thinking in terms of the perceptions about Lincoln and what the Civil War was truly about. These are a series of documents that we're going to go through on Thursday. You can see that these are about the politics of Reconstruction, specifically Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction versus Congress as you're going from 1863 into 1864. And it starts off here with Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. And I highlighted a few parts here about whether or not he's wanting to be strict or lenient to the South and who's really in charge of Reconstruction policy, as well as who's taking the oath of allegiance and the status of slaves and the relationship of the Confederate governments. So if you look here, this section really kind of talks about the states that are in rebellion, offers a full pardon, which clearly is lenient, gives a sample of the oath that he wants them to take. The only people that he thereby kind of restricts from taking the oath of office or taking the oath of loyalty are going to be those that serve in certain positions of the army or in the government. So these are pretty generous terms, right? You see that he clearly argues that slaves are supposed to be given permanent freedom, and that they need to be provided for education. And that's pretty much it. Like, he doesn't give a whole lot of specifics about what else is supposed to happen. And then he goes on to say that he'll let the issues about admitting people into Congress up to the congressional kind of controls, the different committees that are in charge of the way the Senate and the House work. So this is kind of the overall proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction that comes from December 1863. So you can definitely see that this is kind of his overall plan. Now, later on, he's going to come back on December 8th when he's giving a message to Congress talking about how we need to get these former states into the proper relationship, right, with the United States. And so this is what he's trying to accomplish. And if you look at his justification, there's a lot of effort being made in essentially trying to present this as both, number one, a war measure, and as a way of encouraging people in the southern states to come back on board with the United States. Clearly, his desire to punish the Southerners is very limited. He doesn't see this as a matter of rebellion. It's almost as though this is more of a family squabble, and we should just forgive, and that kind of thing. And you can see here where he talks about the resumption of national authority. He also asserts that the executive office has the power to do this, and has said this several times, that the office of the president has the right to do this, and that you essentially see that getting back into the proper relationship with the federal government is of utmost importance. We see that their concern is that if they don't, or his concern is if he doesn't provide a method for the people that are tired of fighting, the people that want to stop the war, that if he doesn't give them that option, they're not going to be able to. And he doesn't want to back them into a corner where they have to keep fighting for the Confederacy when they don't really want to. And you can clearly see that Lincoln's under the impression that a lot of Southerners are kind of being dragged along into this fight. Now, I would argue that that's not entirely the case, that was a bit idealistic. And that certainly can be argued based on what we know about the Southern class system. But you definitely see that he wants to keep that door open. And he points to other states, particularly states like Louisiana and Arkansas, that are beginning an early process of kind of, reconstituting their state governments. And then he's got border states that excuse me, are already, ending slavery and that kind of thing. So his point to Congress is that this effort is beginning to work, it's beginning to show fruit, that this idea of not being punitive towards slave owning states is by far the better answer. You're going to see here that this is from Congress. This has to do with the Wade Davis bill. What you're going to see are a lot of attitudes about Southerners and about the way they should be treated. First off, you see very clearly they call this a rebellion, and they basically essentially assert the power of the Senate and the Congress to be in charge of this. They also very clearly limit the number of who can take the oaths. Like if you served in any way, if you took up arms against the United States, you are not allowed to be a delegate to the state convention. And there's all these limitations placed upon this. It definitely kind of limits those. Now, they do kind of allow for people that were quote unquote forced to take up arms, except knowing what we know about the South, that wasn't very many people. Most people willingly took up arms. And so you definitely see that they have lots of limitations on creating the state government. They also put together this idea of limiting citizenship for people that were in certain ranks and certain offices. They also essentially say that debts are not going to be paid. And so while you're going to have people that may not necessarily have full citizenship, they're going to also have to pay taxes. And so I think that's, that it's pretty important to recognize that the Congress, the United States Congress, is in a lot of ways really taking away citizenship from white Southerners. And I think that's an interesting dynamic to think of. And you can see farther down, they talk about, that slaves are supposed to be forever free, and that no one can claim their service. And it really essentially is the same thing that Lincoln said, but it's in much more assertive language. And I think that's, again, the Congress really kind of forcing them to accept the end of slavery in terms that are just far more in your face for Southerners than what Lincoln's trying to do. And I particularly find that kind of the removal of citizenship from certain white citizens that had served in the military or served in, official capacity with the Confederate government. When we talk about the role of the law and unjust laws as far as slaves are concerned, especially in Northup's story, can you have people in the United States that, you've intentionally denied citizenship? Those are a lot of interesting kind of pesky questions. Clearly, Congress is trying to penalize the southern states. They're also trying to keep their own power pretty well solidified. Remember, they're benefiting a great deal from this fact that the Southerners are not in Congress. They're not stopping up the industrialization and the westward expansion. And so they kind of would like to see that continue. So that's called the Wade Davis bill. This is their response to Lincoln's plan, because they reject that his plan is too easy. And you see that Lincoln then responds back with a very clear assertion that, he is the president of the United States, has the right to be put in charge, and that, to put this plan of Reconstruction that Congress wants to do, that the Senate wants to do, is going to demoralize a lot of Southerners and end up really kind of undoing the good that's already been done in places like Louisiana and Arkansas. You've got some squabbling over military governors versus governors that are appointed by the Senate. So I think that there's some political ins and outs. Of course, my question is, knowing what I know about the late 1800s Congress, is to what extent are they wanting to benefit and enrich themselves through their appointments of governors? And yet clearly Lincoln's going to think that, well, if I put military governors in place, that's going to be less likely to be corrupted. Now you do have, maybe another alternative understanding of Lincoln using military governors is that would keep the military stationed in the South, which might add some protection to freed blacks. That while Congress is using this language and this legislation to force this, he's doing something that's less offensive, but more practical in terms of actually protecting rights. So that is one way to read Abraham Lincoln's actions and his response, and another way to kind of look at Congress's actions. Although clearly Congress is going on record as being far more assertive about taking a stand on the end of slavery, and really opposing the secession and the existence of the Confederacy and that kind of thing. This is Congress's response to Lincoln's response to the Wade Davis bill. And these are some fighting words, you might say. Remember, this is going into the election of 1864, which is hotly contested for Lincoln at this point. It's around this time that the Atlanta is going to fall, and that's going to tend to soften up this issue. But very clearly, Congress there's some salt in this, if you will. And they clearly blame the president for kind of essentially grabbing for electoral votes, trying to assert his reelection campaign because he's likely not to win, and this is why he wants to do this, and that it would be these former rebel states that would guarantee him a second term, which is awfully ironic given what we know about the 1860 campaign and how the South perceived Lincoln. And basically that he holds for naught this idea of Congress and what Congress's actual power is, and whether it's the constitutional authority. Again, you've got this tension between the branches of government and who's really in charge. Lincoln is a strong president, but he does seem to know where the constitutional line is. And of course, one can question whether or not Congress truly does. They're in many ways going beyond, they're using a federal Congress in a way that really kind of circumvents what the idea of a state Congress is supposed to do. And remember the way the Constitution was set up. So there's some pesky questions with all of this. But they do clearly kind of go after Lincoln. They're highly critical of him, critical of the military governors, that's essentially putting the governorship of these states in Lincoln's hands because he's, of course, the commander in chief and that kind of thing. So it's a pretty significant question that they're going back and forth on. And of course, again, remember 1864 is an election year. This is kind of the historical context. So you have to be careful about pulling this debate over the Wade Davis bill and this initial debate over Reconstruction out of complete context, because there is a lot of other aspects going on. I think at the end of the day, an interesting question to debate, and certainly one that we're going to talk about in class on Thursday for those of you who aren't here, is whether or not the Wade Davis bill should have been signed by the president. The president essentially puts that bill, they call it a pocket veto. He just refuses to sign it. He doesn't technically veto it, because if he vetoes it, then Congress can essentially override that veto. By putting it in his pocket, he stalls the whole process and the thing gets kicked back all the way to the beginning. So it kind of slows the process down, if you will, without letting them build momentum. And I think the pocket veto indicates that Lincoln had some concerns about his election. It was, and different historians will say, oh, it wasn't really a contest. Other people think it was really touch and go. It was a difficult election, to be sure. And so this is where this debate over executive power versus congressional power, and how do you bring the southern states back into the union in a way that facilitates reconciliation and facilitates the idea of republicanism in the way that the Constitution has created. And it's not a simple question. It's going to be hard to really kind of figure out. And so looking at these documents should kind of give you an idea. Also gives you an idea about Lincoln, about the complexity of who he is. And then when you think about your Eastfield objective essay next week, you can think in terms of, what perceptions of him are truly false and made up. And what perceptions of him are accurate. And to what extent does Lincoln ultimately, in his assumption that there are people in the South that really want to be back in a proper relationship with the United States, how does that work with the Cornerstone speech? Does that make sense? Or is Lincoln truly being out of touch? In other words, there may be a great deal of political nuance to what he's proposing, to resisting the Wade Davis bill, things that Congress is being short-sighted on. But at the same time, maybe he's not being completely realistic about the conditions of the South. So I don't know which form of Reconstruction would have been better. We never really know, because what we end up with is a delayed congressional Reconstruction that ultimately backs away from some aspects of the Wade Davis bill, but then reinstitutes other aspects of it. So we'll be talking about that more in the next semester. So hopefully this kind of helped you look through those documents a little bit and make some sense out of them.